further, I would like to congratulate those of you that have obtained your degrees today. I also hope that in whatever profession you find yourself, your academic training will be of value. Let me add that I am absolutely delighted to be here for another reason, which is that I have a long association with the University of Hyderabad, and I regard it as one of my most favorite universities. Deciding on what to speak about today has been problematic. Historically, we are at the moment in a kind of midlife crisis. The past has faded, the present is uncertain, and the future even more so. This is a moment to pursue, to pause, and to reconsider what we have been doing. Neoliberalism has been adopted by those governing and by those aspiring to govern. The ideological differences that once provided alternate paths to development are becoming invisible. The space earlier given to dissent and debate is now so narrowed that it almost does not exist. Criticism is seen as anti-national, as sedition. Yet, this space for alternate thought and discussion is the spine of any democratic system. In all this, the definition of an Indian identity is changing, and some of us, at least, are alarmed by the change. Our identity at the time of independence in 1947 was broadly an all-inclusive Indian identity. The sub-identities of religion, caste, and tribe were subordinated to the identity of being Indian. The change over the years is that these limited identities are now taken as primary identities. This is part of the reason why there is repeated recourse to expressions of hurt sentiments by persons claiming to speak for an entire community. This becomes a ploy to ban the kinds of books that present alternate views and make us think differently. Politics has become the play of communities and vote banks. We have forgotten that governance by whichever party implies an ethical and developmental purpose. It is routinely claimed that actions are taken for the good of the people. If this phrase could be replaced by the good of the underprivileged people, then it might sharpen our perceptions about the nature of our actions. The question then is, can we restore the space that we earlier gave to the legitimacy of alternate thinking and to the definition of identity? I believe that this may still just be possible. From those in academia, it would require a substantial intervention in correcting the course of such educational policies that are creating deeper problems. Do we have the courage to plan and implement alternatives? I would argue that education implies at least two main activities. One is that of providing an educated citizenry. The second is to ensure that existing knowledge in every field is continually assessed and, where necessary, is replaced with advanced knowledge. Having an educated citizenry sounds easy enough. There is legislation in place that would enable us to go ahead particularly with primary and secondary schooling. But curiously, over 60 years, that is 2 generations of having the freedom to establish schools, we remain low on the international literary scale. One needs to ask why governments of all political parties have been lethargic in this matter. Perhaps there is a fear of an educated electorate, as would upset vote banks and vote bank politics. Or is there a reluctance to build more schools because schools do not have the same political clout as new universities? Or is there an indifference towards those aspects of governance which relate to the underprivileged? And I'm referring to water, food, health care, employment, education, and social justice. Yet extending quality education would facilitate these aspects by producing better professionals in each field. But legislation is not sufficient. The right of every child to education has to be accompanied with a massive program of building small schools in the neighborhoods of the underprivileged, and not just in upper caste and upper class localities. It also requires an extensive program of training teachers in new methods of teaching and in obtaining up-to-date information. Both of these are critically lacking in our schools and colleges. There is a dependence on textbooks, for example, but there is no vetting of the quality of textbooks. The publishing and prescribing of textbooks is scandalous in many places where it has been commercialized and monetary returns are all that matter. We do not even use the facilities that we have. For instance, teaching in schools could be supplemented by dedicating one TV channel to such teaching to interpret information. If quality education is made available to all, then the problems that have risen with reservation will to some extent be sorted out. What started as affirmative action is now spiraling out unendingly. Legitimate demands from underprivileged groups cannot be met merely by increasing the quota. This stymies the existing educational functioning. The system is also producing new social inequalities and resentments, which take violent forms sometimes. That only some categories of Dalits are eligible for reservation quotas is objected to by other categories who have also suffered social stigma and oppression, such as Muslim, Sikh, and Christian Dalits. And now there is a different category in the making with the frequency of attacks on women by religious right-wing groups. The demands of the OBC will also increase since reservation extends to employment quotas. Identities of majority and minority and other communities are social constructs and therefore can be changed. Politics may have dictated these decisions, but it would be more rational to define such policies by reference to the poverty line, as then the identity would be more inclusive. The expansion of reservation quotas is less effective as a social investment if it is without the backup of quality education for everybody, and without it being set in an improved socio-economic index. Affirmative action would yield better results if other requirements of social welfare were also part of the plan. Today, large numbers of ill-educated school leavers, Dalits, non-Dalits, tribals, every category, are seeking admission to universities. If this continues, there will obviously be a problem in the existing pattern of teaching and the maintaining of standards. There is much merit in the argument that a good foundation of education through secondary school may be of greater help in reformulating the tertiary sector of university education. Universities have many functions, but two are significant. One is to prepare the new generation to be responsible citizens and enable them to join professions. Universities in themselves do not raise standards of living. This is done by having an economy where social welfare is not just an entitlement, but is a tangible reality. A good education enabling a decent start to professional life would be a considerable help. But responsible citizenship is governed by the values of society in general. The second function of a university relates to the question of knowledge and is more specific. It implies that ideally every branch of knowledge should be available at university level. This leads to many problems. Universities are hugely diverse in size, funding, governance, and what they teach and how they teach it. Should all universities provide access to all knowledge? When expanded on a vast scale, accompanied by the expansion of aspirants to university education, it might be necessary to consider that clusters of knowledge might be assigned to different universities. But if all knowledge at a research level is to be available at a university, then inevitably its intake has to be restricted to those sieved through rigorous qualification. It will create an intellectual elite, but one drawn from all strata of society. There also has to be some way of rationalizing the many substandard universities that are now being established all over the country, both state-funded and privately funded. State-funded universities are finding it difficult to get qualified faculty. Private enterprise goes in for mega bucks, hence the churning out of professionals linked to high-income jobs. Stringent quality control, although necessary, is receding in many institutions, both private and state-funded. The content of what is being taught requires exposure and debate. What finds its way into a textbook or a syllabus cannot be inducted or removed without discussion between those involved in the teaching of the subject. But where it is garbage, it has to be called that. Unfortunately, in our current teaching habits, the quality of the textbooks dictate either the opening or the closing of the student's mind. Other factors tied to limited identities also play a role. For example, the current trend of treating the culture of the majority community as virtually the national culture, excluding others, and this closes the minds of many. In this, the influence of the NRI role model, so eagerly adopted by middle-class India, also plays a part. The pattern of culture upheld by some influential NRI groups grows out of a ghetto situation where an alienation exists from the host culture where the group is located. Virtually all diasporas of any kind, Indian, Irish, Chinese, whatever, thrive on contorted versions of the past, packaged as heritage and tradition. They float on a fantasy world envisaged as the ancient homeland. These versions go against the grain of the Indian experience over millennia of history and are divorced from contemporary reality. The categorizing of universities will inevitably bring about a hierarchy and therefore another kind of problem. But on the plus side, it will provide a range of professional interests that might be more suitable to students. A minimum uniformity could be achieved by a foundational first-year syllabus taught at all universities. This could focus on ways of thinking and how to articulate what one thinks. What are, in effect, the great lacunae in Indian education? The medium of higher education is now often the regional language. This excludes students from advances in knowledge which are frequently available only in English. For many disciplines, comprehension of English has to be radically improved. Instead of every BA student studying the same limited subjects, the range could vary from one university to another. There is a tendency these days to confuse disciplinary training with vocational training. A frequent example of this, which I come across all the time as a historian, is when committees of various kinds argue that tourism is a subject that can be taught in the departments of history or archaeology. My last experience of this was in the Deccan College some years ago, when we argued ourselves silly before a UGC committee saying tourism is not history and archaeology. An MA in history, for instance, is essential for those who intend to teach these subjects in schools and colleges. It is also useful for those who go into jobs of an allied kind, such as law and administration. Such in-depth degrees are not required in vocational type jobs such as in tourism. The preparation for these would be better taught as a vocational subject with reference to a region, with environmental studies, history, economics, literature, and local patterns of living forming a package. Shortcuts catering merely to balancing budgets can be an academic disaster. Equally disastrous is the belief that some subjects are redundant and can be axed from the curriculum. No subject is redundant, especially now with the emphasis on interdisciplinary research. But let me add, but each of these subjects has to keep pace with advanced knowledge in its field. You cannot teach something that is 30 years old and go on saying that it is relevant. Subjects change and relevancy also changes. The integration of science with the social sciences is a matter of extreme urgency, given the speed with which technology is making unforeseeable changes in social life and culture. If non-scientists need to understand the importance of nuclear energy, nuclear scientists have equally to understand how this energy impacts human lives by the manner in which it has been used so far. Courses and syllabi need to be looked at afresh at regular intervals to incorporate those new perspectives that are academically valid. We place too much insistence on every university teaching the same courses and then repeating them decade after decade after decade. When I joined the Center for Historical Studies at JNU, it had only a few faculty members and no students during the first semester in 1971. We were told to use the time to frame new courses and syllabi that did not repeat the pattern from any existing university, and that they had to be of an interdisciplinary nature as far as possible. 1971 was intellectually a most exciting year for me, as I was forced to think differently about ancient history and discuss my ideas with others in framing the syllabus. We did produce an entirely new program which attracted brilliant students from every part of the country, and it was a sheer intellectual joy to teach them. We have the scholars, but we need to allow research without multiple restrictions. Research has to be put through a rigorous assessment by peers both in India and elsewhere. I'm emphasizing rigor as a priority, since even some academics do not distinguish between the popular and the scholarly. Teaching innovative courses and rigor in research does not require implants of foreign universities. In any case, their best scholars will not come to India until we can provide them with a context that is conducive to teaching and research such as their own. We also have to cultivate an intellectual interest in the civilizations beyond our borders. On this crucial aspect, we have at the moment no expertise whatsoever. The central universities were originally established as pace-setting universities, but by now, so many extraneous factors have intervened that only a few of them have any pace to set. Indian scholars working in Indian centers have not produced a Nobel laureate in many decades. And yet, when Indian scholars work abroad, there are many more Nobel laureates. This has to do with up-to-date facilities for research, but it also requires the freedom to think autonomously and to cut through what one likes to call the Ji Hazur culture in our institutions. Do we as academics give in too easily to extraneous factors? I would like to conclude by saying that it is not my intention to be pessimistic about the future, but I do think that we have to pause and think with clarity about where we are at. Further, we should think about the content and context of education and change it in the interests of purposefulness and relevance. To do so, we as academics have not only to nurture our autonomy and set our sights high, but also to work towards making education generally more meaningful. The question we face, and I leave you with this question as new graduates and as older faculty members, the question we face is whether we can leave the future to its own devices, or should we give it a direction? Thank you.